Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Anonymous Hedgehog podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Maya.
And today we're going to talk about sort of the whole concept of nature versus nurture when it comes to intelligence. So, is intelligence genetic, or do you gain smarts through your education system?
So I've always been obviously it's kind of a mix of both, but I've always been under the presumption that intelligence is pretty much largely genetic. Because I don't know, there's I remember when I was learning psych in high school, there were twin studies, and twins that were raised separately are always they have twins that are raised separately, they have their intelligence or their IQ score is more similar to their twin than it is to their the family that they were raised in.
Oh, really?
And so and also I have some friends that their parents are for example really smart, and then they have just a natural intelligence. So it's not that I can't be as smart as they are, but they have to work they have to do less work to be that smart. So it's I would feel I'm relatively the same intelligence as them, but I definitely do have to work harder to achieve that.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, I've heard a lot of people talk about that, you have to work twice as hard to get to the same spot as me, blah, blah, blah type of thing. But honestly, I've never really bought into it. I've always been under the impression of if you work hard, you will reap the benefits no matter where you start. And it's just like the people that have lower intelligence have just invested their time in other things. And that's why they're at a lower start than you are.
I feel I get this a lot too. I mean, I feel this is both sides of the coin. People have told me that I am naturally smart, and but I honestly have never felt that I'm naturally smart, because the reason is because back in elementary school, I was really dumb. I was the last kid in my class, in my kindergarten class, to learn how to read. And I was so dumb. I couldn't read basic words like cat and dog and stuff, things like that. But now I'm considered one one of the smarter people in my class. But so people, I always find it so weird when people come up to me and they're yeah, it must be so nice to be naturally smart. And I'm I'm not naturally smart at all. I spent really long hours studying and things like that. So I almost feel I feel intelligence can be genetic, but it almost if you I feel you shouldn't assume that because someone seems smart, it's genetic, because it kind of takes away from their accomplishments and the work that they do.
Oh yeah. Okay, well, I definitely agree with that. Never assume that someone's smart just because they were born smart. And that goes with sports also. Just because someone finishes first on the track doesn't mean that they just have good genetics. It's because they've been training incredibly hard, and maybe they also have good genetics. But for me personally, I think with intelligence, it's just there is no concept of genetics when it comes to intelligence. I just feel everyone starts at the same spot. And then at that point, it just moves on to priorities. So someone that spends 90% of their time doing art obviously isn't going to be as smart as me in terms of math, right? Because I spend a lot more time doing math. I've taken advanced math courses, and I know nothing about art. But if we were to test each other on our math skills, I would be more intelligent. But honestly, because they've dedicated their time to art, they are more intelligent in terms of art. So I guess it comes down to what your priorities have been. And for some people, their priorities are just so scattered that they're moderately intelligent in so many different things that it just seems like they're unintelligent people. But in reality, they've just been concentrating on so many different aspects of life.
That's true. I think the reason that we kind of disagree on this is because I feel our definitions of intelligence are quite different. You were saying that they're intelligent in terms of art, but for me, I don't think that's intelligence, because what I think of intelligence, I think of being able to learn things quickly. That's what I think is genetic. I think there's a difference between intelligence and knowledge. I think when you're talking about with math, that's kind of knowledge. That's not really anyone can learn knowledge, right? But intelligence, right. I think of it as when I learn something in class, I I pretty much never pick up topics quickly. Like I have to go home and stare at my textbook and like for a few hours, and I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. But there are some people that just pick it up right away, and that's what I think about when I think of intelligence. Like our end, like the end point that we arrive at is the same. Like we both learn the same concept, but they like their ability to learn things was just like quicker than me.
So it's like it's not knowledge per se, because everyone can pick up knowledge. It's the rate of picking up knowledge. It's like the derivative of knowledge. Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's just like, and in fact, I have seen examples where students talk about like with standardized tests with the SAT. It's like, oh, like I didn't even study for it and I got a 1550.
Yeah.
And then there's people like me who like spent hours on hours with months of preparation, just like locking my room and just studying hard to get like that same type of score. And it's like, well, if you didn't even study and I had to work so hard, what's even the point of trying? But honestly, like I honestly 100% feel that the people who say like, I didn't even study, they're lying. They're lying.
Yeah. I feel like that's why it's so hard to judge natural intelligence too, because everyone wants to flex how much they didn't study, right? And then ended up getting a good score. So you can never actually trust people when they say like, oh, I didn't study, because I for sure know that they just locked themselves in their room and studied for hours and they got there. It's like, yeah, I didn't study at all.
Exactly. I've been guilty of doing that too. When people ask me about like, oh, did you study? I tend to say like, oh, like only a little bit. Because I don't want to be like, I studied so hard, because then that's also a flex.
Yeah, I always downplay how much I study, because in reality, like I study like like an unhealthy amount, like for a lot of tests. But like I don't ever want to admit that, because I don't know why it's like it's just bad to like. I don't know, why is it considered bad to like say that you studied a lot? I don't really get it.
I think it has to do with like, if someone's asking you if you studied, chances are they're asking because they didn't study and they want to feel better about themselves. So like if you respond to them saying, did you study, with yes, I studied a lot, then that's just going to make them feel like, oh, like shoot, like I didn't study and I was just trying to gain validation from this question.
That's true. That's like, we ask so many questions to like gain validation from like each other. Like, yeah, we ask, like, the reason we ask, like, these questions is because we want to feel better about what we did.
Exactly.
Like, if you said, like, if I didn't study, I'm like, oh, did you study? Then it's okay that I didn't study. But the truth is that someone else not studying, like, doesn't actually have any impact on whether or not you should study.
Yeah. Yeah. And we do this in so many different spheres. Like, I know when I go to, like, birthday parties or something and they're vague about, like, a dress code, I'll ask my friends, like, oh, did you dress up?
Yeah.
In hopes of them saying, no, I didn't, because I'm not dressing up.
Yeah, that's so weird. It's just like, I feel like our individual, it's almost like we ask the question knowing that we're wrong. Like, we know that like this is not right, but as long as other people are wrong too, and we're all wrong together, then it's totally fine.
Yeah, so if we ask the question knowing that we're wrong, and that means we already know the answer to the question.
Yeah, we already know the answer to the question.
So why do we ask it? It's for validation, right?
Yeah, it's almost like, it's like almost like the whole mob mentality. When like 5 people show up, for example, like when 5 people don't end up dressing up, then it's like you want to be in like the majority, kind of like, because you don't want to be the one that did dress up.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so even if it's in the wrong side of the majority, you want to be in the majority.
That's interesting. Yeah, like 100% studying would have been the best option. But if everyone else didn't study, then there's no point of studying. Even though it's going to end up hurting you, it's better to just be in the majority.
So does this like, I feel like this brings up an interesting question. Like, is just because like, so does the majority like because the majority of people believe something, like, does that make it like right almost? Because in the sense that like it was wrong before, right? Like not dressing up to like a birthday party, whatever. It was, I guess, like if they, if like you expected people to dress up and you're like, oh, I'm not dressing up, but then you find other people are dressing up, like that was a wrong kind of decision before. But since the majority of people made it, then that becomes the right decision. The people that did dress up are like sort of in the wrong. Yeah, because they're sort of the odd one out. And like they didn't want, like, they would have rather not dressed up and been in the majority.
Yeah. Yeah, that means that our entire like perception of what's right and wrong can be so heavily changed just by like what other people are doing, which honestly shouldn't even be a factor. When we talked about like moral objectivity in our previous episode, I can't even name which episode because there's so many when we talked about this. It was like we never came to a conclusion about whether morality is objective, but we did come to a conclusion that like morality at a certain time is objective. Like at any point in society, there is an objective moral code, but that code changes over time in the grand scheme of things. But at some point, it's objective. So if we have an objective moral code to follow, then why is it influenced by what other people are doing?
Yeah. No, yeah, exactly. Like, it's kind of like the whole idea of, I've always wondered this with the whole idea of democracy. Like when people vote for like a policy, like just because people vote for it doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct, right? Like doesn't mean that it's right.
Oh,
right?
Yeah. I watched this video, and it was about like three brothers who own property.
Yeah. I
You
watched
watched
that
it
too.
too?
I think I know exactly what you're talking
We
about.
watched all the same videos. I don't know how it's possible. But yeah, just to summarize it, it was like one brother owns the majority of their property, and obviously all three brothers want the most property they can get. So they do a vote to distribute the property, and the two brothers that don't have all of the property vote to take all of the third brother's property, which obviously that's morally wrong. Like just because the majority is voting to take your property doesn't make it right to take your property. But in that case, like they have the right to, because they had all decided that we were going to democratically distribute the property.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that we think of like democratically elected officials or whatever as like fair or whatever, right? Like a democratic election is one that is fair, but like if we're in a room and like with like five people and four people vote to like kill the fifth person and take all their money, then like that's obviously wrong. But it was like a democratic like process. Like we all decided, and that was our like the will of the majority.
Yeah, so democracy sometimes can be so evil. And like you see that with like even with Nazi Germany. Like it was like the majority of like the German population was okay with what was going on just because like they had been convinced that it was like morally right to do what they did to the Jews. But obviously like the democracy in that case was objectively wrong because that was morally apprehensible. But yet they still like, well, they didn't vote into doing so, but their actions like supporting Hitler, like that was what had caused the Holocaust to happen, the democratic justification of the Holocaust.
This is an interesting point because like I've always wondered like for example, like in the United States or something like I mean, we're like a representative democracy, but just like if we were to like democratically, I think this is written in the Constitution actually. Like you can't democratically elect like a king or something like that, right? Or like I feel like I remember when I was learning about there was something that prevented. There's something like that, but it's like if like we live in a democracy, but what if us as a democracy we decided to make it a dictatorship? Like we elected a person because like we decided to make it a dictatorship. Like is that still a democracy?
That's so interesting.
Because think of like Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Like he has like high approval ratings in North Korea, right? Like people in North Korea love him. He's like a celebrity.
Oh yeah. So that is a democracy. Because if there was an election, and I'm pretty sure they have like fake elections, but even if the elections weren't like rigged and they put up someone else against Kim Jong-un, like Kim Jong-un would win by a landslide. So technically that is a democracy because everyone would support him and everyone would vote for him.
Yeah, this is like interesting like yeah, what if we like ran someone against Kim Jong-un? Like he would like win like for sure and like nothing would ever change. Like we see this in China too. Like in China like President Xi, he's like like they do have like basically like fake elections and like he always wins by like a landslide. And I think there was like one or two people that like voted against him, and like
Yeah.
he always wins by a landslide. And like
Yeah.
people think of like, I mean, they have elections. Like obviously there's things like rigged elections and whatever.
Right.
But like
But ignoring
at the
that,
end of the
yeah.
day, like the majority of people prefer that form of like government. Like
Yeah. Because they haven't, well, we can't even say why. We can't say they prefer it because they haven't been exposed to another government. We can't say that for sure because we don't know. And it could just be that that form of government is objectively better than our government. And we just don't know.
well, I know that for people in China, they like, I mean, so now like China's open, like they are exposed to like because a lot of people immigrate to America and whatever.
Oh, yeah.
They are exposed to the American way of government, and I would say that overwhelmingly, like Chinese people prefer their government or like the way that their government works. Because like
Oh, really?
I was actually talking about this with my mom yesterday, and where I had watched a documentary of them interviewing a lot of Chinese people. And they were interviewing Chinese people on the street. They're kind of just like, oh, like, you know, in China, like Instagram, Google, YouTube, Twitter, this stuff is all blocked. Like, does that bother you? And then they're like, no, like, we're willing to sacrifice those freedoms for our safety. Like, they were just like, yeah, like, we don't really care about like free speech and like whatever, these things like that, because like we're willing to sacrifice it. And there was this actually Australian man who had immigrated to China, and he was just like, yeah, like I thought in Australia, like I had all my freedoms and whatever, but I realized like I don't give a shit about that. Like what I care about is like being able to order my food and it's coming to me in a taxi, and like I get to order like hot pot and this comes to me within 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And like it's kind of the idea of like, yeah, it's like different priorities, and like Chinese people just they're consciously aware that they don't have those freedoms, but they just don't really care.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Because especially as an American, like it is drilled into our like minds from the start. Like you are free, you're privileged because you are free, and like no other country in the world has like the amount of freedom that you do. But it's like, okay, well, if America has so many freedoms and America is the best country and freedom equals best country, then why don't all the other countries also incorporate this value? Well, it's because there's some drawbacks to such freedom. And obviously we love free speech and things like that. Like they allow us to make this podcast right here, but like taking away free speech, like that takes away a lot of problems that the nation would face. Like any protest that like tumbled the economy,
Exactly.
like that's not a problem anymore because there's no free speech. Like it's easy to just prosecute someone for saying something wrong. And like I don't know which one's better. And it's odd for me to say if I don't know if free speech is a good thing because it's been ingrained in our minds since the start that it's a good thing. And I honestly, like, I think it's a good thing, but there definitely are sacrifices we are making as an aggregate people in order to have these freedoms.
Yeah, like you said, like we have a lot of like, for example, like our political discourse right now is like so poisonous, so toxic.
Yeah.
And we have like so much disagreement. And then like, yeah, like you talked about like the protests, like the riots and things like that. And it's like, it really like destroys the economy. But like in a one-party state, like that's so irrelevant. Like the stuff doesn't happen. But also in a one-party state, like here in America, I could put up a video on YouTube, like criticizing the government, like I hate America, you know, the government sucks and like whatever. But like in China, like, yeah, the Secret Service coming to your door and like you're gonna get like, but at the same time, like, I guess they don't have an urge to do that. Like they don't care enough to like, they don't see like not being able to put up a video criticizing the government as like a huge drawback. They would rather have, you know, like their, like I was talking like the Australian guy, like he was like, yeah, I can have my food delivered to my door anytime that I want. Right. And like, we don't have like this kind of social unrest that America has. And it's just like, yeah, it's like different priorities.
It's like the quality, obviously you're not able to go out and scream like hate speech, I guess, against the government. But you are able to live in the comfort of your own home and capitalize on the fact that you're living in one of the largest economies in the world. And like just the fact that by censoring the media and censoring the people, the government takes away the people's right to be politically active, which I think in a sense means that those very people have to channel that energy into something else like technological innovation. right? Like if you're not able to spend hours on end attending protests and, sending out emails and like creating petitions and doing the things that are inherently American that we do here every day, then you're going to spend that time and energy like building a startup or like creating an app or basically trying to innovate. And I think that's what leads to the fact that like China is such a huge industrial giant. Like everything is made in China. And it's because they're not focusing so much on things like politics.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. That's, because I remember like at the height of the kind of COVID-19 in China, my dad was talking about how like right next to his family's apartment complex, they were building like a hospital like just before coronavirus, and it was built within a few days. But like
I saw that too.
Yeah, in America, you would have to propose it and you have to vote on it. And then you have to like, like the property, like whoever owned the property, and you have to vote on this proposition, whether or not the citizens want a hospital built here. And like,
the environmental regulations.
Yeah. And then the government just said they want it built, and it was just built. Like, it was just like that simple. Like, it's kind of
and
like
even then there's like, you have to private contractors or do you have to hire like government workers to build the hospital? And then like the people that you hire for the hospital, like there's extra regulations for moving doctors around, blah, blah, blah. That slows things down so much.
I was actually thinking about this in the United States, kind of like, how we have like a two-party system, right? And so the Democratic ideology and the Republican ideology is like vastly different. But each side thinks that their ideology is like the correct one. But what happens is like we end up with like a mix of both policies, right? But the truth is that if like one side is right, like if the Democrats are right or if the Republicans are right, like what we're actually doing is like getting further and further away, because like if one of them is right, we're getting like a mix of both, which is like the worst, if that makes sense.
Exactly. We need to just stick to one thing, and instead of focusing on the discourse, focus on like what you said, like building a new hospital. And another example of that is like in China, because they have so much surveillance, they created like tracing apps, like contact tracing apps.
Yeah, but here in America, we value our privacy and like like that.
Yeah, so it's like privacy's coming in the way of like our health, because those tracing apps are doing like huge benefits into figuring out who has COVID and who doesn't without having to actually test them, because we just see like, did they interact with someone who had COVID? That kind of app is not going to ever make its way into America.
Yeah, and also like in case like people are listening to this, like we're not saying that like America should be a dictatorship or whatever. We're just like, it's just a thought experiment. We're not actually like saying that we think that we should abolish freedoms in the US. But yeah, like because I was thinking like if the Republican ideology is correct or if the Democratic ideology is correct, it's kind of like we just get a blend of like the worst of kind of both sides or something. Like nothing we do, because like I remember thinking about this a while ago. It's like, for example, like Democrats, they would pass a tax increase, and then the next two and then a term passes and the Republicans just get rid of the increase, and then another term and the Democrats. I'm just like, okay, so what is the point of doing any of this? You're just going back and forth and right, you're never gonna get to like, you're never getting to like one of the ideologies that people think is correct.
Exactly. It's like for every 2 steps you take forward, you take 3 steps backwards. I remember like in Obama's era, there was like a huge deal about like Obamacare, and then Trump came in and I think he like repealed it or something like that.
Yeah. And I was just like, okay.
I was like, yeah, this was like millions of dollars of a project, so much time spent on it, and now it's gone. And like, obviously I don't have a stance on, in fact, I know nothing about Obamacare.
Yeah, it's not about Obamacare itself, but just like Obamacare, like replace that with like any legislation, right? Like it's just like
always going forward then backwards, forward then backwards, forward then backwards.
Yeah, so like I guess like what is the point? Like how is America like? I mean, I would say we're still relatively prosperous. Like how does this work? Like how are we like not just like an absolute like.
Are we prosperous? Like so I've always thought of America as like number one country. I'm so privileged to live here, and I still think that. But like ever since this COVID like pandemic, and I've been looking at the way other countries have dealt with it, and honestly it seems like we might not be like the number one country. And I read a lot of articles about this too, about how COVID has shifted America's, like the way people view of America as like a world superpower way down in the rankings, just because like first of all, we didn't deal with the virus like fast, quickly. Second of all, once the virus did infiltrate our country, like we still couldn't respond to it like well enough. And then just like our economy's just been spiraling downward. And then there's also like places like Canada and Sweden and those places, like you don't hear news about them. They're almost never on like the global news networks. But if you actually read like data about those countries, like they seem to be prospering really, really well.
Yeah, no, I've thought about this too, and I think this has a lot to do with our systems of. I remember learning like it's just like our systems of our government. Like our government is just like it was designed to be slow, and that's what the founders intended. Like they wanted like legislation to be like they didn't want legislation to be able to pass really easily because they thought that would lead to some kind of like dictatorship or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, but I was like reading about how like the regulations of the FDA and then the regulations of the different like governors at the state level and just like and how like it's like I mean you can use the national government, but at the same time if you were to use the national government, a lot of things, like a lot of people would oppose that because it's like tyrannical, right? People are talking about this with the protests too. Like when you deploy the National Guard, like people think that's kind of tyrannical, but also like there's civil unrest in the country and there's a lot of property being destroyed. So like I think it is like our, like, cause I think a lot of it does have to do with like with freedoms comes like responsibility because like, I remember watching a Canadian YouTuber, and I didn't know this before, but she was like, yeah, free speech doesn't exist in Canada. Like, even though you think
really?
Canada, even though you think Canada is a relatively democratic, relatively free country, free speech doesn't exist in Canada. And like,
wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was like, wow. So like, I mean, they're like, it's obviously like a different degree to like China, but still, it's just like,
Oh, yeah.
And so like a lot of these like the criticisms, because like we have like so much criticism of like different government, different policies, whatever, like that like fuels our like news cycle and our debate. But like,
always,
and I was thinking like, imagine like not having that. Like imagine just like people not just like, you know, two sides shitting on each other about what policy is best, like whatever. No, we're like, no, you're the tyrants. No, like we're the you're the tyrants. And then it's just like everything just kind of spiraling around this political like toxicity and discourse.
Yeah, toxicity. I like that phrase, political toxicity.
Yeah, like it's just like we waste so much time just like arguing about like which policies and like, you know, like the Congress like with the executive branch and they have like all these like squabbles and like just whatever. And it's like we waste so much time dealing with that stuff that like when it actually comes to, you know, dealing with the things that matters, like we are like our reaction time is quite slow. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, same, like I keep coming back to this, but like with COVID, it was like if you want to shut the country down quickly, it's like, oh my gosh, Donald Trump shut the country down and he barely even like, he didn't even take a vote and like he didn't listen to his advisors. And it's like in that type of situation, you just need one strong-willed person to just say, no, we're shutting the country down. And it's like, there's so many regulations and things like that. I personally have witnessed this. I think I've mentioned to you in the past, but I was a part of like the student government thing, which was technically a real branch in our city government. So like every time we had a meeting, like we had to take meeting minutes and actually send them to the real like local government. So it was, everything we did was a part of the government. And even at that local level, the way things ran, it made it so that I didn't even want to join again like the second year because it was so slow. Everything we did had to be written down and like voted on. Even even something as simple as like passing a motion to like delay a meeting or something because of like if school wasn't in session and we wanted to delay a meeting, we would have to pass the motion. 2 people would have to say aye. They'd have to write down the names of the people who agreed to pass the motion. Then they'd have to send that motion over to someone higher up in like the local government. They'd have to agree and approve and they'd send it back to us. And then they'd have to like convey the information back. And it's like such a long process to do such a simple thing that it made me realize, like going back to what you said about like toxic politics. I think that's what you said. Like honestly, I feel like discussing politics can be toxic at times, and that's why I sort of just want to like take a step back and not really listen too much about like what's going on politically and focus more on like STEM advancements in the news and things like that.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think like that's crazy that like something like even like a school like government has to go through all these like dumb like regulations and things like that. Like that's like actually insane. I think the thing that I've always felt with government in the United States is that like the government can't win with regards to people. Like what you were talking about, like shutting down the government, like if Trump had shut down the government, like let's say like in January,
Or shutting down
like,
the country, right?
shutting down the country, the economy, not the government. Like if we had shut it down in January, that would have been like, people would have been like, man, that's like a tyrannical move, right? Like that's like something a dictator would do.
Yeah.
But then he shut it down like a little too late, and people are like, man, you wasted too much time, and like you should have done it earlier.
Yeah.
But then I'm like, okay, like you can't win, like you know,
can't
and
win,
it's just
no.
like it's crazy. And like now with like more riots and things, like people are saying like, oh, if you deploy the National Guard on rioters, then that's like, you know, tyrannical use of power. But at the same time, like what are you supposed to do? Just like let them like run over the city and just like
and then if
like,
they do run over the city, it's like, oh, you should have deployed the National Guard earlier. Why didn't you deploy it?
And a lot of governors actually like want like the National Guard deployed, and like I don't, it's like I feel like with American government you can almost just like never win over the public, like the public, never. Because I think a lot of it does stem from our like free speech kind of thing. It's just like because we have such a freedom to criticize our government freely, right, with like you know, like with like very few repercussions, it's like it's so easy to criticize the government, and so like the government can never win over that kind of public opinion, exactly, no matter what they do, because like we can so easily criticize, but like our voice criticizing the government has very little ramifications for us, but their actions have such big ramifications. So it's kind of like the balance of like power here.
And when our criticisms influence their actions, it's just a positive feedback loop that ends up screwing everyone over. That's so interesting. And again, like we're not trying to say that
we're not saying that the US should be a dictatorship. Like,
we're not saying that regulations are bad. Like obviously like there are protocols in place for reasons, and like it's thanks to those reasons that we're even able to make this podcast. But it's so interesting to just think about what it would be like if those regulations weren't in place, and if we lived in a country that had an ideal moral authority that always acted in the right way to just guide our nation, so that we wouldn't have to waste our time discussing politics and we could spend our time doing things that mattered.
Yeah, that was a good sum up of the topics that we discussed. Okay, so we'll just end it there. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you all next time.